The year is 1099. The holy city of Jerusalem has just fallen to the Crusaders. Blood runs in the streets. Thousands are dead. And across the deserts of the Middle East, something stirs. Muslim warriors, scholars, farmers, and leaders look toward the horizon and ask one question: how do we take it back? What followed was nearly 200 years of one of history's most brutal and complex conflicts, the Crusades. Armies clashed across deserts, mountains, and ancient cities. Men marched for months through burning heat and freezing winters. Supply lines broke down. Diseases spread. Starvation threatened both sides. But the Muslim warriors who fought in these campaigns had something powerful on their side: a food culture, a survival tradition, and a spiritual discipline that had been built over centuries. Their diet was not just about staying alive. It was deeply connected to their faith, their identity, and their will to fight. Today, we uncover the remarkable story of what Muslim soldiers ate during the Crusades, how they fueled their bodies, preserved their food in brutal desert conditions, and found strength not just in their meals, but in the act of eating itself. Welcome back to this channel where every week we travel through history to discover how the world's greatest civilizations survived their darkest moments through food, faith, and willpower. To understand how Muslim warriors survived, we must first understand the land they came from. The Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, Persia, and Egypt, these were not lands of abundance. They were harsh, dry, and demanding, and the people who lived there had spent centuries learning how to extract maximum survival from minimum resources. The single most important food for Muslim warriors during the Crusades was the date. This small, sweet fruit was the perfect military food. Dates are extraordinarily calorie-dense. A handful provides enough energy to keep a man walking for hours. They do not spoil easily in hot, dry desert conditions. They are light to carry. They require no cooking. And in Islamic tradition, the date holds deep spiritual significance. The Prophet Muhammad himself broke his fast with dates, making them not just food, but an act of faith. Muslim soldiers would carry dried dates in small leather pouches tied to their belts. On the march, a soldier could reach into his pouch, eat a few dates, drink some water, and keep moving without stopping. This simple system gave Muslim armies remarkable mobility. They could cover ground that slower, heavier armies could not. The second essential food was flatbread, called khubz. Baked in large quantities at camp, flatbread could be carried for days. Combined with dates and a small amount of oil or dried cheese, it formed the backbone of the Muslim soldier's daily ration. Simple, portable, sustaining, dried, and salted meat, usually lamb or goat, was also carried on long campaigns. The drying and salting process preserved the meat for weeks without refrigeration. When the army made camp, this dried meat would be reconstituted with water and cooked into simple stews with whatever vegetables or legumes were available from the land. If food was important, water was everything. In the deserts and semi-arid lands where the Crusades were fought, control of water sources was often the difference between victory and defeat, not just in battle, but in survival itself. Muslim commanders understood the geography of the Holy Land far better than the Crusaders who had traveled from distant Europe. They knew where every well, every spring, and every river was located, and in some of the most brilliant military strategies of the era, they used this knowledge as a weapon. The great Muslim commander Saladin, who would eventually recapture Jerusalem in 1187, was a master of water warfare. Before the famous Battle of Hattin, Saladin maneuvered the Crusader army away from water sources and into the dry hills above the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders, exhausted and desperately thirsty, were surrounded. Their horses were dying of thirst. Their soldiers could barely lift their weapons. Saladin then attacked and won one of the most decisive victories in the entire history of the Crusades. Not with superior weapons, with water. Muslim armies traveled with dedicated water carriers, men whose only job was to ensure that water reached every soldier on the march. Large clay jars called kulal were used to store and cool water through evaporation. Camels, uniquely suited to desert conditions, carried enormous water reserves across distances that would have been impossible for European horses. Here is something that most history books overlook entirely. For Muslim warriors, food was never just physical fuel. It was a spiritual act. Every meal carried meaning. Every bite was connected to something larger than the individual soldier's hunger. Islamic dietary law halal meant that food had to be prepared in a specific way. Animals had to be slaughtered properly. Certain foods were forbidden entirely. On campaign, maintaining these standards was not always easy. But Muslim commanders made it a priority, because they understood that a soldier who feels his faith is being respected fights harder than one who does not. Perhaps most remarkably, some Muslim armies observed Ramadan, the month of fasting, even during active military campaigns. From sunrise to sunset, soldiers would eat and drink nothing. And yet, historical accounts tell us that some of the most significant Muslim military victories in the Crusade era occurred during Ramadan. The soldiers fought not despite their fasting, but with a spiritual intensity that the fasting itself seemed to create. The breaking of the fast at sunset, called iftar, was a moment of profound communal bonding. Soldiers would sit together, share their dates and water, and eat a simple meal. In the middle of a brutal military campaign, these daily moments of shared food and shared prayer created a cohesion that was almost impossible to break. When Muslim armies made camp for an extended period, their kitchen operations were far more sophisticated than most people imagine. Unlike the Roman army, which relied primarily on grain, Muslim armies had access to an extraordinarily rich food culture built on centuries of trade along the Silk Road and Indian Ocean routes. Spices that were exotic luxuries in medieval Europe, black pepper, cumin, coriander, turmeric, cinnamon, were common, affordable ingredients in Muslim military camps. These spices were not just for flavor. Many had genuine medicinal and preservative properties. Turmeric and cumin have natural antibacterial qualities. Cinnamon helps regulate blood sugar. The Muslim soldiers who ate spiced food were, without knowing the science, eating food that was genuinely healthier and safer than plain European military rations. Lentils and chickpeas were staple proteins, cheap, filling, easy to store, and incredibly nutritious. Rice, when available, was cooked with meat and spices into a dish that would be recognizable today as an early form of what we now call pilaf or biryani. Olive oil from the groves of Palestine and Syria was used abundantly. Honey served as both sweetener and medicine. Crusader knights who had contact with Muslim armies, sometimes through trade, sometimes through truces, were genuinely astonished by the quality of Muslim camp food compared to their own rations. Several Crusader chronicles from the era contain admiring descriptions of the spiced dishes, fresh bread, and organized kitchen systems they encountered in Muslim camps. No discussion of Muslim survival during the Crusades is complete without talking about Saladin Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the Kurdish-born Muslim general who became the most celebrated military leader of the entire Crusade era. What made Saladin extraordinary was not just his military genius. It was his understanding that an army fights only as well as it is fed, housed, and treated. Historical accounts describe Saladin as personally supervising the distribution of food to his soldiers. He ensured that even the lowest-ranking soldiers received adequate rations. He fed prisoners of war. When Jerusalem fell to his forces in 1187, in stark contrast to the massacre that had occurred when the Crusaders took the city in 1099, Saladin organized food and water distribution for the defeated population. This was not just compassion, though Saladin was genuinely known for his mercy. It was strategic wisdom. A commander who feeds his soldiers well creates loyalty. A commander who treats defeated enemies humanely creates a reputation that makes future enemies more willing to surrender. Food was power, not just physical power, but political and moral power. The Muslim warriors of the Crusade era survived not because they had more soldiers or better weapons than their enemies, though often they did. They survived because they had built a food culture that was deeply practical, spiritually meaningful, and remarkably sophisticated for its time. Dates that gave instant energy, flatbread that lasted for days, spices that preserved food and healed bodies, water systems that turned geography into strategy, and a spiritual framework that made every shared meal an act of community and faith. When we look at the food that sustained Muslim armies during the Crusades, we are not just looking at history. We are looking at the roots of a food culture that still feeds hundreds of millions of people today. The dates, the flatbread, the spiced lentils, the lamb stew, these foods have survived for 1,000 years because they worked. They kept people alive. They kept people strong. And they kept people together. If this journey through history moved you, please subscribe to this channel. Every week, we uncover a new civilization, a new crisis, a new story of human survival through food and willpower. Next week, we travel to the frozen north to discover how Viking warriors survived the brutal Scandinavian winters and fueled their famous raids across Europe and beyond. Like this video. Leave a comment below telling us which civilization survival story you want to see next. And remember, every meal you eat today carries the wisdom of 10,000 years of human survival. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in history.